Okay, so in learning objective 4, we're going to look at the other main macroeconomic policy that is made, which is fiscal policy. So we got done talking about monetary policy, which is conducted by the Federal Reserve Bank, or the Fed, or any country's central bank conducts monetary policy. The other type of macroeconomic policy we see is fiscal policy, and that is the government changing its spending and taxing. And so, again, what tools does the government have at their disposal to combat a recession or to combat inflation in an expansion, and in the same way that the Federal Reserve was doing it? And it has really two main tools that it can use, and those tools have different components, but it has its spending. So that is what we call G. And remember, that is government expenditure on goods and services, right? So the government buys goods and services. And so they can decide, we're going to buy a bunch more goods and services, right? So I can start building new schools. I can build a new library. I can construct new roads. I can just, flat out buy other goods and services, right? So I'm going to buy a bunch of books. Anything you can think of, the government legitimately could decide it wants to buy. And so that is one policy tool. We'll try to understand how does that affect the macroeconomy if the government decides we're going to start buying more goods and services. So it can change its spending up or down. And the other main tool, obviously, is taxes. And so there's several things that the government can play with respect to its taxes or tax policies. And one is, it can change tax rates. Right? So, a lot of you realize that you pay income taxes. So you go to work and you get a paycheck, and you'll notice on that paycheck that some part of your earnings were withheld to pay your federal and state taxes. And so that's an income tax, right? The more that you earn, you pay a percentage of that income in taxes. And so one tool that the government has is that it can decrease or increase the income tax rate. And so, this is one of, probably the most debated aspects of government policy is should we increase or decrease the tax rates at any point in time? So as long as I've been around and paying attention, at least, I haven't seen really a period of time go by where I haven't read something or seen some discussion about current tax rates and whether or not those are too high or too low. So this is always in play, and the government can use this lever to make some changes when it's trying to use fiscal policy to affect the macroeconomy. So I can change the tax rate. I can increase or decrease the tax rate. And I can also use what we could call as tax rebates, which is really just a transfer. This is like a transfer payment. So we've had currently a $1,200 per person tax rebate with $500 for each kid or child under your care, right? So that is the government decreasing your taxes, but it's doing so via a rebate, a lump sum rebate, right? So they didn't change your tax rate that you pay per extra dollar you earn. They didn't change that tax rate exactly. They're just giving tax rebates. And that also can apply to companies, right? So businesses also pay taxes to the government. So they pay them indirectly with sales taxes. And then they also pay them on their workers, right? So you go to work and the firm has to pay some taxes on the wages that they pay you as well. And so the government can obviously decrease those tax rates or increase those tax rates they charge on firms. or they can provide some type of tax rebate, which is effectively what they've done now by providing forgivable loans if you're paying your workers, right? So the payroll protection program, it was called PPP. And so that really is an example of a tax rebate targeted towards firms. So these are the kind of the main things that the government has in its toolbox to combat a recession or inflation and expansion. And so the goal of this policy is exactly the same as monetary policy in the following sense. The goal is to change labor demand. So in a recession, the goal is to increase labor demand. And in expansion, if we're using contractionary policy, so this is expansionary policy, in an expansion, we're trying to decrease labor demand, and that is contractionary policy. Now, as you'll see, we're going to focus mostly on, for the government, expansionary policy, which they use in a recession, because this is the one that they typically use. So the government very, very rarely, even historically, has engaged in contractionary policy for kind of obvious reasons, right? Contractionary policy, as we'll see, is going to decrease employment. It's going to make the economy do worse than it currently is, and that's not something politicians are necessarily eager to do. Whether or not it's the correct policy is another debate, but they certainly aren't eager to hold the economy back. Okay, so that is kind of the brief introduction to what tools the government has. And what we're going to do next is look at how these work exactly and what they do to our model.